And so when I'm at a union meeting now, I'm sitting there thinking the official position of this branch is that I'm a Nazi. So that's kind of what they call a hostile environment, I think.
My guest today is Professor David Hirsh, an expert in anti-Semitism and the senior lecturer in sociology at Goldsmiths University. Professor Hirsh is the author of the book Contemporary Left Anti-Semitism and the founder of the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism. He has written extensively about modern anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and is currently at the centre of an investigation by Goldsmiths after he was ridiculously and offensively labelled as a far-right white supremacist by Goldsmiths' then Students' Union president. Professor Hirsh, thank you for being here. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm shaking my head because I'm not a professor, which some might say is related to the issue that we're discussing. I'm a senior lecturer.
So let's talk about your book, Contemporary Left Antisemitism. It was published in 2017 and looks at the manifestations of anti-Semitism commonplace on the left, which often involves the use of Israel as a means of spreading anti-Semitism. What made you decide to write the book?
Oh wow, the book took me a very long time to write. I mean, I was pulled into these issues in 2005, really, at the time of the campaign to boycott Israel, and especially Israeli academia. And I wanted to put out a book fairly quickly after that. I don't know, within the next few years after that, anyway. And I found that very difficult for two reasons, I think. One was that I was there was a lot of heat, really, for my work and for what I was doing, and I found it very difficult to be kind of recognized, really, as a as a proper academic, and I found it difficult to get things published. And also, I believe that the hostility that I experienced from my peers, really, from other academics, and from a wider layer of people too, I think it had some effect in kind of hurting my own self-confidence and my own ability to write. So it took a very long time for me to feel that I was able to do it, and for me to actually be able to do it, and for me to get it published. I think it took, 2017 is 12 years after 2005.
I mean, that sounds really hard, to be honest. How do you feel now in terms of your status among your peers?
Well, I think that I think it's funny because I watch other people's experience, and I think the experience is really, I recognize the experience, and the experience is that there are Jewish people who feel at home in some kind of space, as I felt at home in a sociology department. I was very proud to be in Goldsmiths Sociology. I remember looking around the room during department meetings and thinking, wow, I'm one of these people, and being kind of almost in awe of it. And then what happened was that I made some straightforward arguments against the campaign to boycott Israel, Israeli academia in particular, and against anti-Semitism. And then suddenly I was transformed from being one of those people to being not one of those people. And I was treated broadly in academia and within the discipline as not a sociologist, but a Zionist sociologist. And in that vocabulary, Zionist means racist. So it's I mean, and it's very interesting to me that it's an experience I've seen happen again and again to people in the Labour Party, to people on the left of the Labour Party, and to people in other spheres, really. That they thought that they were at home. They thought that they were one of those people, and then they kind of discovered that they weren't, or at least that their position of being at home was challenged. And it's hard when that happens. And I kind of sometimes think that this might be a sort of universal story of anti-Semitism, or maybe even of racism and exclusion in general. Although I suspect it isn't, because I think plenty of Jews in the past, and actually plenty of other people who suffer racism, never thought they were at home. So there's not that feeling of being suddenly excluded. So maybe in a sense that particular feeling comes from a kind of relative privilege that I did think I was at home, and then I found that I wasn't.
That's interesting, because I think we hear a lot about Jewish university students feeling ostracized once they are, I suppose, outed as a Zionist or something. But we rarely hear about it from Jewish lecturers and staff members at universities. Do you think it's because it happens less, or there's more of a taboo around it, or why do you think that might be?
No, I don't think it happens less. I think it's the same issue. I think so. A lot of lecturers are, they worry about their reputation and their career, and talking about contemporary anti-Semitism, and in particular talking about their own exclusion, doesn't help their career. So lots and lots of Jewish academics focus on their own work, whatever it might be, maths or even in Jewish studies, they focus on 19th century Yiddish literature or whatever it is, and they keep out of the sort of ostensibly political discussions about contemporary anti-Semitism. So one of the effects of anti-Semitism on campus, I think, both for students and for academics, is it shuts your mouth. It makes you feel quite unable and unwilling to speak and to say what you think, and actually also to work in that area. Actually, both for academics and for students. Students need to think carefully before they write an essay that might be on this topic or an adjacent topic, and academics need to think carefully if they want to teach on it or to publish on it, because academic careers are very tough already, and the last thing people need is to have their reputation transformed into, quote, supporter of apartheid or supporter of colonialism or whatever it is.
Yeah. Your university, Goldsmiths University, recently launched an inquiry into anti-Semitism at the university, and this investigation, as a whole, began after you were smeared as a far-right white supremacist by its then student union president. Where did that slur come from, and what can you tell us about the investigation and how it relates to you?
Well, I can talk to you about the incident that you refer to. I don't know in what way that incident led to the inquiry or didn't lead to the inquiry. So I can't really say much about how they are linked. But let me begin by explaining that incident. It really came out of discussions about what is called decolonization of the curriculum. And I think so. So there's a kind of official university endorsed campaign to, quote, decolonize the curriculum. And the idea is that universities, like any other institution that have been going in Britain for some time, have a sort of tradition that goes back to colonial times and ways of thinking that perhaps go back to colonial times, and that we should be careful and mindful to break from those colonialist traditions. Now, that's fine by me. I'm, all in favor of that. there's a problem, I think, when, and this is more general than these particular campaigns and policies, the problem is when the value of decolonization or anti-imperialism is separated from other left-wing and democratic values, or other liberal values too. So there are lots of left and liberal and democratic values, right? One of them is opposing colonialism, but there are many others. There's the rule of law, and there's freedom of speech, and there is women's equality, and there's lesbian and gay equality, and there's equality from poverty. And, one could list many, many values that are values of the left and actually values of liberals. What has happened sometimes is that the specific value of anti-imperialism or anti-colonialism becomes a kind of single overriding value, and it's made itself into an absolute. So there's not a number of values that sit alongside each other and have to be taken together, but there's this one value which is an absolute, and every other value is subordinated to it. And you can see how, for example, the value of anti-imperialism might interact with the value of democracy in a whole number of quite complicated ways, or the value of freedom, or the rule of law, for example, or the value of women's rights. And that's pretty straightforward, I think. And in this particular case, I was very mindful at the time that there's a campaign which is strong at Goldsmiths, but in many other places and many other universities, to designate Israel as colonial, as a colonialist enterprise. And actually, there are some senses in which it might be, but the raising of the value of anti-colonialism to an absolute tends to raise Zionism as colonialism to become an absolute. Actually, it's a long discussion that one could have, because one can look at the worldview of relating colonialism and anti-colonialism to the other values, but then how one moves from there to centering Israel as the kind of central and symbolic issue is another story. So you can't explain it just by saying that the world is divided into imperialist and anti-imperialist, black and white, and that becomes overriding. That still doesn't tell you why Israel gets centered, which is a problem, because then you kind of have to explain anti-Semitism in relation to pre-existing anti-Semitism. Anyway, that's a distraction. The point being that so long as Israel is designated as colonialist, then as an absolute, then campaigns of decolonization will become, or have the potential to become, campaigns of de-Zionization. And a campaign of de-Zionization, which would be endorsed by the authorities in an institution, would feel threatening to me. There are, student groups and postgrads who are going through reading lists and singling out courses and authors who are not considered to be anti-colonial. And I wouldn't want to see that happening with people who are designated Zionist, and therefore designated racist, and therefore designated as being unsuitable for inclusion. I mean, one could imagine, it sounds bizarre, and it probably is, but one could imagine somebody saying that, Albert Einstein is a Zionist, and therefore his work shouldn't be taught on campus.
Right.
Now, that's a kind of extreme example, but there are many extreme things going on. So a little bit out of context, I tweeted in response to somebody that there is an anti-Semitic edge to these official campaigns of decolonization of the curriculum. And for the reasons that I just gave, I think that's kind of clearly true, that something which will be seen to legitimize campaigns of going through reading lists and taking out the Zionists, I think certainly might become anti-Semitic. So I said there is an anti-Semitic edge to these campaigns of decolonization, and somebody else replied, probably the tweeter themselves replied, "You're a racist." Like, if you oppose campaigns of decolonization, you're a racist. And then the president of our students' union piled in and said, David Hirsh is a far-right white supremacist, which is more than a racist, actually. A far-right white supremacist sounds to me like Nazi, actually. That's, I think, evidently an anti-Semitic statement, to wrongly single out, the person at Goldsmiths who's doing the most work against anti-Semitism, and who's doing that work in a context of being against racism, and in a context which sees work against anti-Semitism alongside work against other structures of oppression. To single that person out and denounce him as a Nazi is anti-Semitic. And people shouldn't need to ask why, but if they ask why, I would say because given that there's like zero truth in it, then my mum was born in Nazi Germany, right? And huge proportion of her family was killed by the Nazis. And to then sort of say that I'm a Nazi is egregious. I think it has a particular edge when mobilized against Jews. I could say more about that, but it seems to me that that's true. I wrote an email or two, I think, to the college, and I said, "What are you going to do about this?" And I think, from memory, I think they said, "Well, are you making a formal complaint?" And I said, "No, I'm not going to take responsibility for this. This is your problem." The person elected to speak for your students has said this anti-Semitic thing about one of your members of staff, and what are you going to do about it? And of course, it's quite difficult for them to know what to do about it. And I don't quite know what they did about it, but I think that what happened was that they approached the student union, and the person involved got to hear about it and was furious, and said that this was a witch hunt against her, and it was a racist witch hunt. And she doubled down on the allegations that she'd made against me. And then my trade union branch, my UCU branch, kind of piled in and offered full support and solidarity to the president of the Students' Union in saying that. So what we had was a situation where the person who's elected and paid to be the voice of our students, and the people who are elected and paid to be the voice of me and my colleagues, were agreeing that David Hirsh is a far-right white supremacist. And I think, like, you might say that's a little bit formal, right? Because you might say, well, everybody knows that the president of the union and the union branch don't speak for anybody, and that they are elected, by a minority and all the rest of it. Well, that's true, but formally, they speak for everybody at the college. And the fact that nobody's jumping up and down trying to get that fixed is tells you something about the culture at the college. In fact, what happened was even stranger, because I did make a fuss within my department, union group. I'm a member of the union. And actually, there was a little bit of sympathy and warmth and support. I mean, there's always a little bit, like there are always people who are solid It's not unanimous by any means, but there was some support, and the reps in the department said, "Well, we'll go and talk to the union branch and see if we can get this fixed." And so then there followed I don't know, a period, a week or 2 weeks or something, where there was a fight going on about whether it was legitimate to say David Hirsh is a far-right white supremacist or not. And just the fact that there's a fight going on between my colleagues about that is already kind of utterly humiliating. And even more humiliating is that my department colleagues in the union lost, and the union stood firm and refused to do anything about it. And then people said, well, we should write a formal letter to the union branch, or we should make it public. And some people went away to try and draft a letter, and they couldn't do it. Nothing happened, right? And presumably they couldn't come up with a form of words to say that we stand by David Hirsh. He's not a Nazi, and he's a kind of vaguely decent teacher. They couldn't find a form of words to say that, and then they just dropped it, and it that was the end of that, really. And so when I'm at a union meeting now, I'm sitting there thinking the official position of this branch is that I'm a Nazi. So that's kind of what they call a hostile environment, I think.
Yeah, I mean, to say the least. If you don't mind my asking, what sort of impact does this whole thing have on your mental health?
Well, I don't know how to answer that, really. I mean, I never have particularly wanted to. I never have really, discussed personal issues and how it impacts upon me personally. But I mean, evidently it must, and it must have done. And I've been dealing with this stuff for 20 years now, for the kind of main part of my adult life and the main part of my career as an adult. And sometimes it's really hard. So, and I don't like to blame whatever neuroses I have on anti-Semitism, but that's part of the issue, isn't it? That with all racism, nobody knows what component of the crap they get they can actually blame on what's been going on. And as I said earlier on, I was finding it very difficult to write and to produce and to be an academic. And then what happens is you get knocked back by peer reviewers who say this isn't really academic, this is propaganda for Israel. And when that's happened, it then becomes much harder to write because you don't have a warm academic community around you encouraging you and saying, oh wow, this is really interesting, you're really clever, and blah blah blah. You have people around you saying you're a fake. Hashtag it was a scam, right? The whole of my career, hashtag it was a scam. And people need an academic community around them for a reason, right? We have universities for a reason. And that's part of the reason. Look, of course, it's complicated because I can go and speak at universities all over the world, and I have done, and I can walk onto campus, I don't know, in America or in many, many places in Germany, and people go, oh wow, it's David Hirsh, we love your work, we think you're really cool, and they call me professor, which I'm not because because I've never been promoted anywhere near it, but they assume that I am because they rate what I do, and so sometimes I get treated with that kind of great respect, and then sometimes I get treated with nothing but contempt. And that might be a kind of universal for academics, but it's worse. I think it's worse in this context.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you've gone through a hell of a lot. In addition to this investigation to your case, as mentioned before, Goldsmiths is also doing a wider investigation into anti-Semitism at the university. What are you hoping you to see from this investigation?
So the investigation isn't into my case, as I understand it.
Yeah.
The investigation is an investigation into anti-Semitism and I think institutional anti-Semitism at Goldsmiths, which is really interesting. I mean, it's a real surprise. Like I could tell you a story about SOAS, which I will just tell you the kind of punchline of, really, which is that I was asked a few years ago to chair an appeals panel at SOAS, and the appeal was over a case of somebody alleging institutional anti-Semitism, and the panel said that it hasn't been investigated and it should be investigated, and it laid down some very clear ways in which it should be investigated. And SOAS just completely ignored the decision of its own appeals panel, just ignored it. And I kind of pushed them and I hinted and I nudged. And then after a long time, I kind of went public and said, SOAS isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing. And then they put up a thing online saying David Hirsh is in violation of his contract and has been, violated his duty to be, what's it called? Secrecy, confidentiality. And they tried to kind of bully me to shut up, really. I said, what contract? I haven't signed a contract. And they said, oh, well, it must be an implied contract. And I mean, honestly, it took me a lot of struggle to get them to take that basically defamatory thing down off the website. And they also said if I mention it again in public, then they'll put it back up. So we'll see what happens after this discussion. Point being that, SOAS absolutely stubbornly refused to even contemplate the idea that it had a problem. And Goldsmiths is doing the opposite. We've seen barrister-led inquiries that have had good results, and we've seen barrister-led inquiries that have had not so good results. So a lot depends on the barrister, and we'll see. We'll see what happens. We'll see what evidence emerges. We'll see what what the report says. I hope that people who have had experience of anti-Semitism at Goldsmiths make submissions. I hope that people, even if they can't kind of, I mean, of course, details of particular things that have happened are really important. But, people are aware anyway of the culture and the way it feels to be a Jewish person on campus. And they should write about that. They should remember it and describe it. Interestingly, I don't think, there haven't been many complaints of anti-Semitism at Goldsmiths. And I think one of the reasons for that is there are not many Jews at Goldsmiths. And it seems to me there's a reason for that too, which is that Jews, unless they are from a particular kind of anti-Zionist political tradition, probably think they know by reputation in advance not to apply to Goldsmiths. So that's also something that I think the inquiry has to get to grips with, really, is not only what happens at Goldsmiths, but why and how it has this reputation and what that means about the exclusion or a kind of soft exclusion of Jews not coming anyway.
Yeah, I mean, Goldsmiths is interesting because while its initiative to launch this investigation into anti-Semitism at the university is certainly commendable, it also does things like adopting both the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and the Jerusalem Declaration. It's a document intended to undermine the globally recognized IHRA definition. Why have they, and other universities I suppose, but why have they decided to do this? Why have they decided to do both? And can you explain to our listeners very briefly about why the two are incompatible?
Yes, well, perhaps we should be a little bit careful and say that we don't know what the intentions of the people who drafted the Jerusalem Declaration were, or the people who signed it, or whatever. But we know what it does. And actually what the Jerusalem Declaration does is to pick out elements of contemporary anti-Semitism. In fact, it picks out some of the most important elements of contemporary anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic discourse, and it treats them in the abstract. So it says, I can't remember the exact wording. For example, it says BDS, and I think, for example, it says analogies, presumably including the Nazi analogy, and it says it's got some wording of sort of intemperate and extreme speech against Israel. It picks out those things, and it says, in the abstract, in and of themselves, these are not anti-Semitic. And of course, that's true, right? In and of themselves, these things are not anti-Semitic, but in the context in which they actually appear, they are the key elements of anti-Semitism. So it's a kind of I don't know, it's a kind of bait and switch, really, because every academic knows, and every scholar of racism knows, that nothing happens in and of itself. Everything happens in a social context, and the social context in which Israel is, relentlessly denounced as uniquely the apartheid state, and as central to all racism on the planet, and as symbolic of all racism on the planet, and as the only state that should be boycotted. There's a social context there, and we also know empirically, not in and of itself, but we know because we've looked and we've experienced it, we know that with that kind of context comes anti-Semitism, like the kind of anti-Semitism that everybody can recognize. It's interesting, isn't it, that and this, you saw this with Corbyn and the Labour Party, is that the anti-Zionists were very kind of careful not to articulate anti-Semitism in a way that everybody could recognize. But annoyingly for them, it leaked. It always leaks around them and sort of comes out. So when they say things that they insist are not anti-Semitic but only anti-Zionist, people who support them and who are influenced by them start saying anti-Semitic things. And that must be really annoying for them, poor things. But it's one of the pieces of evidence that anti-Zionism always brings that kind of explicit anti-Semitism with it. I mean, there are other elements to the argument, of course. So the Jerusalem Declaration abstracts the key elements of rhetoric, and it says in the abstract they're not anti-Semitic, and it doesn't say anything about whether they're anti-Semitic in context. And of course, IHRA, interestingly, does the opposite. IHRA says that anti-Zionist anti-Semitism is significant, and it's real, and it generally looks like this and this and this and this. But you should always judge any case in context, right? Because whereas it generally looks like this, you have to judge any particular case in context. And then it's very clear that criticism of Israel, made in the same way that criticism of other states is made, is not anti-Semitic.
Right.
So IHRA actually is very clear about context. And IHRA is also very, very tame, right? IHRA doesn't designate anything as anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
It just says there is this kind of anti-Semitism which is significant. It generally looks like these things. And if you see things that look like these things, then you should make a judgment according to the context about your case. So, interestingly, IHRA, which is kind of denounced as being vulgar and not academic, is actually much more in keeping with the traditions of anti-racism and the sociology of race than the JDA, which is just a sort of abstraction. For sure, in the privacy of some academic's brain, BDS might not be anti-Semitic. Fine. They might have all sorts of ways in which in their brain, in principle, it's not anti-Semitic. But let's look at it in context, and let's see how it works. Let's see what it brings with it. Let's see what kind of emotions emerge with it. Let's try to understand why there's a focus on Israel and what the focus means. and let's try to understand the effects of such campaigns. And we've seen it, in UCU, in the Labour Party.
Yeah.
We know what happens, and it's an empirical claim, right? I don't think that BDS is anti-Semitic in and of itself. It's not. But I do think that it's very clear that when you look at any institution or social space in which BDS becomes a legitimate position, you see how it relates to anti-Semitism. You see how it elicits more anti-Semitism. You see how people who try to create an emotional culture such that people want to punish Israelis for the crimes of their state, the crimes of their state real, and the crimes of their state imagined. But you need a certain kind of emotional feeling to really want to punish some, Israeli lecturer who wants to come and join your conference.
Yeah.
So in all sorts of senses, that's what the Jerusalem Declaration does. And I imagine the people who adopted the Jerusalem Declaration alongside IHRA, I mean, either, the anti-Zionists kind of know perfectly well what it does, and they know that it sort of weakens and counteracts IHRA. And I think that underlying the Jerusalem Declaration is there's an allegation against IHRA, and very often it's explicit, and even when it's not explicit, it's implicit. And the allegation against IHRA is that it is an instrument not concerned with anti-Semitism, but actually concerned with protecting Israel. So it's IHRA is accused of being a sort of ruse, right? A trick foisted upon us by Zionists, which designates, legitimate criticism of Israeli human rights abuses as anti-Semitic, and therefore silences them and delegitimizes them. And that's what it's really for. And sometimes you say, all right, well, fine, show me the bit in IHRA that does that, or that allows that. Because what I can see in IHRA is it says criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic. And by the way, IHRA doesn't say that must be in context. It just says it, everything else must be in context in IHRA, but that's not contextualized. And people say, well, it's not really there, but this is, read between the lines, or this is how IHRA is used, which is both very strange arguments. The between the lines argument is a kind of argument of Zionist cunning. They're so cunning that they've created this instrument that appears to do one thing but really does another, which is all kind of drawing on tropes of conspiracy fantasy.
Yeah.
Or it's but you have to look at the practice, the way it's used. And if it's true, it's not. But if it was true that IHRA was used to punish critics of Israel, then that would be illegitimate, because nothing in IHRA allows that. So if somebody was trying to do that, if you're just a person who's critical of Israeli policy, or critical of Israeli culture, or critical even of Israeli whatever, basic law, whatever you're critical of, if someone tries to use IHRA to say that you're anti-Semitic unjustly, then you need IHRA, which says criticism is not anti-Semitic, in your defense.
Yeah.
So both of those arguments hold no water. That, read between the lines, it's all there, but it's hidden, or look at the way it's really used, because it can't be used in that. I mean, it's like, I don't know, it's like saying that the law against speeding in a built-up area can be used against the Arsenal offside trap. And, well, it can't, and if somebody tries to do that, then there you go.
Yeah. I mean, that sort of nicely leads me on to asking you about the Livingstone formulation. For our listeners who are less familiar with this term, could you essentially like tell us what it is and what are its roots?
Yeah. Well, I've just told you what it is. It is specifically, it's a standard response to somebody who raises the issue of anti-Semitism. Somebody who says, "Oh, look, I think there's anti-Semitism here," or "I've experienced anti-Semitism in my union or in the Labour Party," or or the way Israel is blamed for the murder of George Floyd is anti-Semitic. A standard response to any of that kind of thing is to say, aha, we know what you're really up to, right? You say that you experience anti-Semitism, but really we know that you're engaged in a dishonest campaign to try to silence and delegitimize criticism of Israel. So that's the Livingstone formulation, and it's, I mean, it is so ubiquitous. Like, and even in Parliament the other day, I think it was Crispin Blunt, probably others, just said it boldly. That I have to say, criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic, but of course, nobody says that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. It would be an absurd position. And the point about the Livingstone formulation is not Ken Livingstone, actually. The point is that whenever somebody raises the issue of anti-Semitism, um, they're accused. There's a sort of really quick counter-accusation of bad faith. So, so there's kind of three stages here. Actually, interestingly, people will know about the Macpherson inquiry into the murder of Stephen Lawrence, and the Macpherson inquiry found that the police investigation of Stephen Lawrence had been messed up because of institutional racism. And the Macpherson inquiry said the claims of one of the black victims of that attack, Stephen Lawrence's friend, his claim that it was a racist attack should have been taken seriously. And that didn't mean that the police should have believed him without any evidence or without any investigation. That's not what it meant. What it meant was it should have been taken seriously. When he said it was a racist attack, they should have assumed that he was speaking in good faith. So that was kind of set in stone by the Macpherson inquiry, and everybody knows that when somebody makes an allegation of racism, or when they say they have experienced racism, we should take them seriously, and then institutions should take them seriously and listen to them properly and then investigate. But the Livingstone formulation says the opposite. It says when Jews make an allegation or report an experience of anti-Semitism, then one should assume that they're lying, and one should assume that they're lying for Israel.
Yeah.
And to be clear, the Livingstone formulation doesn't say, well, Jews have got a chip on their shoulder and, they had a hard time with the Holocaust and they tend to see anti-Semitism when it's not there. It doesn't say that. It says they're making it up. They're pretending to experience anti-Semitism, but their real motive is to silence criticism of Israel. So the third element then is the EHRC report on Labour anti-Semitism, which said that the kind of unthinking counter-allegation made towards Jews in the Labour Party that they are faking the anti-Semitism, or that they're trying to smear the leader or smear the party for ulterior motives, and the ulterior motive is to delegitimize criticism of Israel.
Yeah.
The HRC report said that doing that is the key mode of the alienation of Jews. Right? When Jews get up and talk about their experience, and if they are then universally told to shut up because they're lying for social forces that are hostile to the party, then they are accused of treachery, of betraying the party. They are therefore defined as being rightly outside of the party, and therefore as being kind of spies or entryists in the party. And that was the nature of the anti-Semitism that Labour Jews experienced. This kind of relentless allegation that Louis Ellman was called the Right Honourable Member for Tel Aviv, for example, that she doesn't belong in the Labour Party, that she really belongs somewhere else, and she's representing a foreign power, or she's representing the apartheid state, or she's representing the Tories or the Trumpists or whatever it may be. So first, Macpherson says respect and treat respectfully somebody who says they've experienced racism. Then Livingstone says, yeah, but not Jews. Because if it's Jews talking about anti-Semitism, then quite likely they're going to be involved in a kind of conspiracy to silence criticism of Israel. And then EHRC comes along and says, yes, Jews. Yes, Jews are included. And not including Jews, in other words, assuming that Jews are up to something when they talk about their experience of anti-Semitism, is itself unlawful harassment of Jews. And that's what the HRC report said.
Well, that kind of leads me on to ask you, to what extent is the sort of anti-Semitism denial that was commonplace on the far left under Jeremy Corbyn's tenure as Labour Party leader still prevalent? Would you say that it is still a serious issue in Labour or more widely, or do you think that it has been relegated to the fringe left since the EHRC report into the party was published?
I think that both are right, actually. So I do think that the politics of the front bench, of the leadership, of the machine have been pretty well cleaned out of anti-Semitism. And I don't think Labour is at all anti-Semitic in the sense that it was under Corbyn's leadership. So I think, my friends who were sort of the political activists in the Labour Party who really fought and won against that kind of institutional anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, great, well done. But the Labour Party still sits in a milieu, in the kind of broad liberal left, in which anti-Semitic ways of thinking are still tolerated and are still considered legitimate and are still fairly widespread, actually. And a lot of the activists have kind of withdrawn from the Labour Party or been kicked out of the Labour Party and are back on campus where they came from in the first place. And the culture of treating Israel as a unique and central and symbolic evil on the planet, and everything that flows from that, is still pretty well alive on campus and in the kind of liberal left more widely. And just to be clear, I'm not singling out the left. I don't think the right has in any sense a better record on racism and bigotry. Absolutely not. In a sense, the opposite. My political home is the left. My natural political home is the left, and I'm interested in focusing on left anti-Semitism because we clean out our own home first. And it's always upsetting when you see people pointing over there, right? Look, over there on the right is the real problem. Yeah. And then people on the right, they point, look, over there on the left is the real problem. And it's beyond me how people can do that, because, of course, right here in my own political family is where I'm concerned to begin with.
Yeah.
And if I say, well, look, it's over there, the real problem's over there, our guys over here, yeah, there's some anti-Semitism, but they don't really mean it. They're basically good guys. But over there, they're really evil. No. So the focus for me on left anti-Semitism is because I focus on the world around me, actually. And the world around me thinks it's better than the right. And it needs to take that seriously if it thinks that.
Well, we briefly spoke about sort of the fringe left, and earlier you mentioned the hashtag #ItWasAScam. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about this. The hashtag #ItWasAScam has been trending repeatedly on Twitter over the years, and it's still used today by bitter far left conspiracy theorists. Can you tell us a bit about what this hashtag refers to, who uses it, and why do they use it?
Well, I think that what it means is Labour anti-Semitism was a scam. And, they articulate in different ways. And if you articulate in one way, they'll say, no, that's absolute rubbish. What we meant was something else. What it refers to are the people who say that there was no particular Labour anti-Semitism problem, or there was no political anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, or that Corbyn's worldview and his claim that Hamas and Hezbollah are forces for justice across the Middle East it didn't exist, it was never said, or it was never relevant or important. So the idea is that the whole thing was a scam. In other words, a conspiracy. There was a conspiracy to pretend that there was a problem of anti-Semitism in Corbyn's Labour Party. And that conspiracy happened for two reasons, one of which was to delegitimize criticism of Israel and to delegitimize Corbyn's support for the Palestinians. And the other was to stop Corbyn from becoming prime minister because it was felt that he threatened, I don't know what, he threatened capitalism, or he threatened the profits of the ruling class or something. I mean, that second element, of course, folds in the experience of the Labour Jews and their articulation of their experience into an old-fashioned claim that they're in fact supporters of capitalism, which is kind of more explicit and more easily recognizable than the more common charge, which is only that they are supporters of global imperialism via Zionism. I think the real problem here, I think, is that I don't know how many, and I'd like to know how many, or I'd like to know how strong the movement is, but without doubt, there is quite a large number of people who experienced the whole Corbyn phenomenon, who were quite close to it and quite excited about it, and who now believe that it was defeated by the claim, the false claim that there was something anti-Semitic about it. And what that comes very close to, and many of them, is what we've learned from this is that in the future, the thing that stands between us and progress, or us and socialism, or us and, quote, good things, is Jewish people making this false allegation of anti-Semitism. And of course, it's completely obvious to me that the idea that the Jewish communities, or the Zionists, or Labour Jews, stand between us and progress, us and socialism, us and good things, it's obvious to me how that's anti-Semitic.
Yeah,
and it's a kind of stab in the back myth. It's they have to explain why Corbyn lost, and they have to say that if it it's kind of Scooby-Doo. If it hadn't been for those meddling kids, if it hadn't been for that meddling Jewish, are you too young to remember Scooby-Doo?
No, I know.
If it hadn't been for those Zionists, if it hadn't been for the Israeli state, then we'd now have socialism in this country, or we'd be on our way, or whatever. So it's a very dangerous. There are cadres of people who have learnt that. Who have learned that between us and progress sits the Jewish communities.
Yeah.
However they articulate it, and of course, that is the consolidation of a foundation of a new anti-Semitic movement.
Mm. David Hirsh, I really want to thank you for coming on. And before we sort of wrap up, I'm going to ask you a question now that I ask all of our guests, which is, if someone who is not Jewish approaches you and says that they want to help in the fight against anti-Semitism, where should they start?
Oh gosh, I mean, I find it quite difficult. I mean, not because I find it quite difficult to know what anyone should do. I mean, really, what I think people should do is they should educate themselves, and they should be prepared to to make arguments, to stand up against false claims, and to stand up against anti-Semitism, and to put themselves in a position where they can, defend the institution or the Jews or democratic thinking against these kinds of anti-Semitic attacks. So the fundamental thing for me is that people should put themselves in a position where they can make an argument, where they understand what's going on, and where they're at. And it's really difficult. I mean, honestly, it's really difficult to be up against these kind of belligerent, relentless, self-important people who think that they are good and they think that you are a racist, right? It's hard. So what I'm asking for people to do is to do something really hard, which is to put themselves in a position where they can deal with that, really. I mean, I should say something about our big project at the moment, which is the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism. And one thing that people who want to help can do is send us some money. Quite seriously, we're having real trouble getting any kind of significant funding, which is quite frustrating at the moment. Because what we're doing is we are challenging anti-Semitism on campus and in academia. And what that means is that like everybody knows that there's a problem of anti-Semitism on campus. Everyone knows that. But most people are not in a position to do anything about it, and most people wouldn't know how to do something about it. And the only way one can do something about it is to fund academic research, which can produce academic books and academic articles and academics and academic teaching. That's the only way one can do something about it. And it's a hugely expensive business. Anyway, we are bringing together networks of people, and we're running seminars, and we're running a book series and a journal, and we are working very hard to try to get some research funding, because of course we are in general locked out of the normal sources of research funding, which think that what we do is, pro-apartheid, blah, blah, blah. So people can see our website on londonantisemitism.com.
All right.
And just one other thing on that is, of course, campuses are the place where people create their own identities for the future. And so what people learn on campus and the culture within which they create their own understanding of the world is really important. And incidentally, so of course is looking after Jewish students and students who wish to challenge those orthodox views. And again, only people on campus, only academics can do that. So for me, it's a really, really important project. And I'm just putting it out there that we need some proper, serious, heavyweight support.
And David, for people who want to find you personally, if you want to be found, where can they do that?
They can find me on Twitter at David Hirsh. They can find me on Facebook, something David Hirsh, and they can find the website of the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism at londonantisemitism.com. And they can find my homepage at Goldsmiths. So if they Google my name and Goldsmiths, University of London, they will find my homepage.
All right. David Hirsh, thank you so much for coming on Podcast Against Antisemitism.
Thank you very much.